Thank you very much, Carmen, for that. I do, please. Thank you very much for that very welcome introduction. And thank you to MOVE and to Anna's VAP for organizing this very significant first tobacco harm reduction conference in Spain. And thank you to all your colleagues and everyone who's done all the hard work of organizing the conference. So it's all started. And now, Carmen, you can relax because there's nothing you can do. Everything will be great. So Carmen asked me to talk about drugs harm reduction and tobacco harm reduction. And you might have noticed in the program that it had the title Two Epidemics. And I just explain that because I'm a social scientist. I spent most of my academic life, I'm now retired from academic life, I spent most of my academic life on public health aspects of illegal drug use. And around the mid-1980s, I got very involved in the response to HIV/AIDS amongst people who inject drugs. And I was part of the development of harm reduction. That word comes into the literature in 1987. And that harm reduction response I was involved in for about 20 years. So eventually I became what I call a card-carrying harm reductionist. And then around 2010, I heard about e-cigarettes. I'd been interested in smoking, but I wasn't sure what the harm reduction model might be for smoking. And when I heard about e-cigarettes, I thought, well, this is going to be the solution. Now, in the field of smoke and tobacco, we have something which would change everything. So I was very excited, and I thought all my public health colleagues would be similarly excited and share my views and so on. But I was very surprised because many of my colleagues working on drugs harm reduction, many of them were in favor of drug law reform, when it came to e-cigarettes and tobacco, there wasn't the enthusiasm and support, and I think I'm putting that politely because, in fact, there was a lot of antipathy and a lot of concerns about tobacco harm reduction. So that was a surprise to me. And also what was surprising, having worked in what I thought was a difficult field, people who inject drugs, HIV, AIDS, all these people that we don't really like who are doing things we think they shouldn't be doing, having worked in a field that I thought was controversial, I suddenly find myself in a field which is even more controversial, even more views on all sides, and quite bitterly controversial because it's not only about evidence, not only about science, but it's also about deeply held views, some moral views about addiction, about nicotine, and in a sense it's about how tobacco control itself became a social movement, but one which I think has some negative aspects to it. So that's where I come from. I've been working on e-cigarettes and tobacco harm reduction now since around 2010. So let me just make a few comments really about harm reduction because it seems to me to be one of the basic elements of good public health. It's quite simple. People do all sorts of things which might cause them harm. We're faced with risks all the time, whether it's so what can we do to try to reduce the harms that might come from the risky things we do? So it's kind of a basic public health strategy, and it's set out clearly in one of my favorite documents, which is quite old now, but the Ottawa Charter on Health Promotion, which is about enabling people to make healthier choices and to lead healthier lives. And that's kind of a positive view of what can be done. But it's also, you can trace it in, also it's sort of there in some of the international treaties on health about the right of everyone to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health and helping people to do that. So harm reduction is kind of all around us because nothing we do is particularly safe. Driving is not safe, but we don't stop people driving, but we try to make driving safer. Number of strategies for alcohol harm reduction, drugs, and I'll come on to that in a moment, but also things like skiing. I mean, there's no safe level of skiing, but we try to make skiing safer for people who want to do that stupid sport and exercise. So, you know, there are many things that are around us that people want to do, but we try to make them make things less risky for themselves and also less risky to others. So with skiing, ski lessons and ski etiquette is not only about preventing harm to yourself, but also preventing harm to other people on the piste. So it's a basic principle of how we deal with a lot of health issues. When it comes to drugs harm reduction, I mean, up until the mid-1980s, most of drugs was about a drug-free world. Just say no to drugs, we can eliminate drugs, illegal drug use, and we can do that by supply and demand reduction measures, international controls over drug supply, and persuading young people, educating young people to just say no to drugs. But we soon learned that that wasn't the only thing that that we could do, and as I've already mentioned, the crisis really was in the mid-1980s. HIV antibody test, 1986. Throughout Europe, we suddenly discovered that a large percentage of people who inject drugs are HIV positive. 30% in Scotland, 50, 60% in Italy, so on and so forth. And governments were faced with the problem that you can't stop those people injecting, you know, you can't just stop the problem by stopping people injecting, so you have to find creative ways to help them avoid risks of infection. So in Europe, in Australia, North America, in the late 1980s, the emergence of drugs harm reduction, which was initially opposed by the World Health Organization. You might think forward now to the World Health Organization and e-cigarettes. It was opposed by other international agencies. It was opposed by many countries who had what I call national immunity myths. It won't happen to us because we are communist, Hindu, Sikh, whatever. But over time, there was gradual acceptance of drugs harm reduction. So more than 80 countries have methadone, 90 have needles and syringes. So public health success, but also continuing opposition, both then and now. And some of these things I'll return to in a moment because you might find those familiar when you start to think about e-cigarettes. Giving needles and syringes to drug users will undermine drugs policy. It will kind of normalize drugs. It will be a gateway for young people into drug use. It will keep people addicted, and the best option is abstinence. So, lots of examples, and here in Catalonia, there are some excellent examples of drugs harm reduction, some creative responses to drug use. Over the last 20 years or so. It came a little late here, but I'm using the example here because we're here in Barcelona and across Spain, wide uptake of all the elements of harm reduction. And I won't go through them, but they're all about trying to reach out to people rather than to push them aside, rather than to stigmatize them. They are about giving people the tools to live safer lives. Help them to have products, safer drugs, and methadone is safer than street heroin. Contacting people through street work, giving them life-saving interventions, access to treatment and care, and so on. So a fairly positive approach to drugs harm reduction in Spain. Just a few examples here from my colleague Xavier Mayo about the extent of methadone availability in Catalonia, syringe volume, outreach buses, 13 drug consumption rooms, one of the highest concentration of safer injecting sites within Europe. And you can see just at the bottom there, this is a safer injecting room. So very positive. And so it comes as a bit of a paradox, which I'll call, if you like, the Catalonian paradox, or the Catalan paradox, or the Spanish paradox, or the strong support for drugs harm reduction, but the dismal support in Spain and in many countries for tobacco harm reduction. So we know smoking is a problem. The world's second most popular drug. Half of all those who smoke will die prematurely. These are WHO strap lines, if you like. 6 million people die from a smoking-related disease every year. Many of those deaths are in low and middle-income countries. And more people die from smoking cigarettes, from malaria, HIV, and TB combined. So, huge problem. And here in Spain, you're not doing so well. You are among the EU 28. I have to change the slide next year because it will be the EU 27 when we leave. But in the EU 28, 25% of the adult population smoke daily. It's actually 26% on the slide, but that's because there are two different data sets here. This is from Eurobarometer, and these are from WHO data. But you can see the ranking there of Spain, 10th highest smokers in the European Union. So, when we move on to what we can do about this, well, we know a whole range of tobacco control interventions, ways to try to move to a world without tobacco. And it's important that many of the international and national strategies are about tobacco rather than about smoking, and that's a problem. Ways of reducing demand and supply, cracking down on smokers and cracking down on industry with an end game which will be an end to tobacco use and an end to of tobacco companies, that they will disappear because they'll have no more customers. And I've also put at the bottom here stigma as a public health tool, just to remind me that remind us that in many areas of public health we work against stigma. All the AIDS and HIV work was to destigmatize drug use and destigmatize sex work and destigmatize sex between men in order to make it easier for people to come into contact. But here, you read documents in tobacco control, which is creatively using stigma, making people feel bad for their own good. So very bizarre for somebody like me who comes from a different public health tradition. But as you might guess, from what I've been saying, it's not enough. Supply and demand reduction is not enough to reduce risks and harms. Because what are you going to do about the 25% of smokers in Spain who haven't changed their ways? So do you just writing them off, do as we tell you to do, otherwise we'll abandon you, or quit or die, as some people say. So you have the emergence of tobacco harm reduction, which has quite a long pedigree, which is basically that most smokers say they want to stop smoking. Many have tried. Many find it hard to stop. The cigarette is the most harmful nicotine delivery device. So if there are other ways of giving people nicotine, that should be a good thing. I said that the cigarette is the most harmful tobacco delivery device because the issue is about combustion. That's what causes the morbidity and mortality. And there's a schematic illustration of this here, and you'll argue during today about just how much safer e-cigarettes, snus, heat not burn, and smokeless tobacco products, just how much safer they are. But they all fall somewhere at the end here. you know, whether 95, 99% or whatever safer, but we'll argue about that during the conference. But see, up here, it's the combustion, the releases of the tars and gases, which are the problem. So if there's no fire, no smoke, you're doing away with a lot of the problems. And of course, if there's no combustion, you're not inhaling toxins and tars and so on. This chart is from a report that we're about to release called, trouble with this little buzzer, oh yeah, No Fire, No Smoke, the Global State of Tobacco Harm Reduction, which we're releasing on October 2nd during the Framework Convention of Tobacco Control meeting in Geneva. When that idea of harm reduction first came up, 15, 20 years ago, about safer nicotine delivery products, there weren't many. There was snus, which is here, Swedish snus. But over the years, we've seen the development of a wide range of electronic cigarettes and more recently, tobacco heating devices, also called heat not burn. So there's a wide range of products available. And they are being used to a greater or lesser extent. These are Eurobarometer data. And here you can see Spain with the 25-26% smoking prevalence and 1% vaping, currently vaping. Big difference between smoking and vaping. The UK, smoking prevalence about 15 and vaping prevalence 5 or 6%. Comparing those two and making them a ratio, you can see that in the UK, you've got about 29 vapors for every 100 smokers, whereas here in Spain, you've got about 4 vapors for every 100 smokers. And you could tell that you could do your lay epidemiology. You can walk the streets of London, walk the streets of Barcelona, and you don't see much vaping here, but you see a lot of vaping in London. So 4 case studies, which for me show that good things are happening. 2 of them are about snus, small sachet of tobacco. And Norway is fascinating because you have seen a rapid drop in smoking and a rapid increase in the use of snus, so that snus is now more popular than smoking. What is even more extraordinary is amongst young women under the age of 25, look, 1% of young women in Norway are smoking. It's almost disappeared, but 14% of them are vaping. So these crossovers is what we're looking for, and in fact that's something that the FDA should be looking at. It's not the problem of youth vaping, but it's how that relates to youth smoking. Another good example, and this is where we do have health outcome data, we have Sweden due to snus with the lowest prevalence of smoking in the EU, and also due to snus, and also it has the lowest rate of tobacco-related mortality in Europe. So this is the level for Sweden, tobacco-related mortality. This is the EU 28, and Spain is sort of there. So the difference between Sweden and Spain is very marked. So for me, and there's a lot of data behind this, but for me, indicative that tobacco harm reduction saves lives. The third example where good things seem to be happening is the UK, and it's really partly in trend data, partly behavioral data, but you see that over the years that this has been tracked, a gradual increase in the number of vapors, and just last week, the latest survey from ASH, Action on Smoking and Health, 3.2 million vapors in the UK. And that's the prevalence, the adult population prevalence there. And this tracks the adult population prevalence of vaping, which goes up to, well, it's 6.2% this year, and the continued decline in smoking prevalence in the UK. Now, association, not causation, but we can add in some other bits of the puzzle here. There's a lot more, but we know now that the most common device that people will use in the UK when they want to stop smoking is to use an e-cigarette, which is this wiggly line here. This is e-cigarettes. This is nicotine replacement therapy. And down here, you've got behavioral support and Champix. So people are voting themselves in the way they best like to stop smoking. The last bit of information that I give you is from Japan, where in Japan, e-cigarettes are illegal. They're used, but they're illegal. But since around 2013, 2014, there's been the introduction of heat-not-burn products. And these are pushing out cigarettes. This is the decline in cigarette volumes to date and predicted by Euromonitor. The blue is, I have to read it. The value of cigarette sales, and the red is the value of heat-not-burn sales. So you can see how heat-not-burn products are eating into cigarette sales. But over here, some data looking at the sale, extrapolating from the sales of JTI, Japan Tobacco, whose market is collapsing in the face of heat-not-burn products. This is the one to look at. So if we take 2016 as a base year, there's been a 27% drop in cigarette sales within 2 years associated with the uptake of heat-not-burn products. So what all this means to me is that safer nicotine products can replace smoking if they're appropriate or acceptable and so on. It can happen quickly. It indicates an appetite amongst smokers for doing something different, for moving from smoking. These trends have also happened mainly without public health endorsement or government support. It's happened often in the face of government opposition. In Sweden and Norway, you have governments very opposed to snus. It indicates that we might see an end to smoking, but not an end to nicotine use, and we'll be discussing that during the day here. Is nicotine use per se a problem? It's happened, I think, also because smoking, moving to vaping or moving to snus or moving to heat-not-burn is not giving up. When you're trying to stop smoking and you're given nicotine replacement therapy, you're already feeling miserable, and you're feeling more miserable because nicotine replacement therapy is not that enjoyable. But all these things help people to switch almost seamlessly from one way of using nicotine to another. And so for some it becomes a bit of a hobby, but it's kind of guilt-free pressure, and it should be stigma-free pressure. But there are people who try to stigmatize e-cigarette users, but we'll come back to that in a moment. So it's a self-help approach. People learn about vaping from each other, from going online, from sharing information, for hobbyists, for those who really like it, going to vape fests. You know, there's never been an NRT fest. You know, that is just not something that anybody's come up with. And there aren't websites extolling NRT products, but there are websites extolling e-cigarettes. So it's all facilitative. It's not kind of coercion. It's not sticks. It's more carrots, if that expression translates okay. And it's all what public health is meant to be about, helping people to control their lives. Not forgetting also, in face of all this opposition, we can't forget the vaping organizations. A lot of the advocacy for e-cigarettes and for snus is done by volunteer organizations. It's not being pushed by public health agencies or cancer agencies or heart foundations and so on. These are the unfunded heroes of what's going on here. There's a selection of the different consumer organizations from around the world, very important in keeping us on our toes about what should be doing. So opposition to harm reduction, tobacco harm reduction. I think public health was kind of caught out. They didn't invent this, and it came from the side. It wasn't that they'd been working on harm reduction themselves and wanted to sell it to people. If they'd done that, it would have been a failure. But it wasn't a top-down intervention. And most public health interventions are top-down, and they cost lots of money. They cost dollars and euros and pounds. So it came from over there. And much of the public health response has been this concerns and threat narrative. You know, you look at the discussions of words like might, may, probably, we are concerned that. So that runs through it. And, sorry. Yeah, so, and you can see, in fact, some of the concerns here on the right are very much the concerns that have been expressed about other harm reduction issues, drugs harm reduction, which is on this slide, but I'll skip that. But a very similar narrative of fear. So just one point, and then I'll try to summarize where I am on this. So we should remember also that tobacco harm reduction is actually there in the main international treaty on tobacco, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. In the drugs field, the harm reduction language was never there, and many countries fought against that language in international meetings. So there is something called the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and the US and Russia and China and Sweden argued consistently to keep harm reduction out of any of the statements. At one meeting I went to, harm reduction, eventually the agreed wording was appropriate support services. You know, you go to these international meetings and all the countries are arguing about the language of the document. So harm reduction was translated into appropriate support services, at which quite nicely the European delegation stood up and said, by appropriate support services, we mean harm reduction. So, you know, there are little games that go on. So it's there in the Framework Convention of Tobacco Control, supply, demand, and harm reduction. But WHO and the countries that go to the Framework Commission meetings, they've ignored harm reduction. It's like 3 pillars, and the harm reduction one has been deliberately ignored. Now, there is a meeting of this convention 2 weeks' time in Geneva, where, as it were, by coincidence, we're releasing our report on tobacco harm reduction. But I won't go more into the human rights arguments because they are there. You can argue that access to safer nicotine products is a fundamental aspect of the right to health. And that's what I've argued with others in a legal challenge to the ban on snus. So, last couple of slides. This is, it's a success for the health of the public without help from, inverted commas, public health, without help from expert public health. That's very peculiar. There are not many changes in health behavior that's occurring from a bottom-up way without public health sort of telling us that we're meant to be doing it. You know, public health is always good at telling us to eat less, to avoid sugary things, to promote sugar taxes, taxes on drinks, you know, on sugary drinks and so on. In fact, that's the sad thing about much of public health now, is that it's got one strategy, which is price. It's lost sense of how people act and how people behave. So the interesting thing for me as a social scientist is that the drivers for this are not public health, but the technological developments, batteries, microcircuitry, and so on, all the things that happened in China with your phone, all these things feed into the technologies here. So the technology is driving this. Consumers are driving it because they are voting with their money. And it's private sector. So how more scary for public health that all these people are doing all these things and we've lost control over it. I mean, I kind of make a bit of a joke of it, but I think there's a sense of that that's going on because this is not public health as you would know it. And unlike nearly every other field of work I've worked in, you've had to persuade foundations or governments to put up money for harm reduction. Gates Foundation, the Soros Foundation, USAID or UK Department for International Development. This actually costs nothing. There's no government money has to be spent on it because it's all being paid for by the people who are doing it. And what could be better than that? So 2 kind of health problems and 2 responses. Compared with HIV, this should be easy. It's not struggling with marginalized people, not struggling with people who are really quite ill. It's not costing you a lot of money. It's happening because people are doing it for themselves. But it kind of comes back to that, that paradox, and I hope we can talk about this during the day, that public health has been many people in many countries are very supportive of harm reduction, more or less, and drug policy reform, cannabis law reform, medical cannabis, more or less, cannabis clubs in Spain where you can buy cannabis, and more tolerant of those areas, but very hostile to tobacco harm reduction and what I would say needed tobacco law reform. So we're going to be discussing some of those issues today, and I think for the next couple of decades. But I hope that that's given you a bit of a feel for where I come from on tobacco harm reduction, and we can have a little time for you to take me to task and to question me. So thank you very much. Should I stand here, or how do you want to do it, Carmen? What do you want to do? I don't have headphones. So.
Thank you, Gerry. I'm Charles Gardner with the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. Can we learn anything about how the World Health Organization changed its mindset around harm reduction in the other epidemics, the drug epidemic and HIV epidemics?
I'm not sure that we can. I think that drugs harm reduction succeeded in WHO because of the success of safer sex programs. WHO, there was the UNAIDS overarching UN organization, of which WHO was a part. And I think drugs harm reduction actually benefited very much from the feeling that heterosexual sex and sex between men, we had solutions there for safer sex, and kind of the safer drug use built on the back of that. So eventually you had people working within the UNAIDS program and within WHO who became proponents for drugs harm reduction. So that's one thing that went on. And the second thing was you soon, within 5 to 10 years, you had quite a number of countries who were supporting drugs harm reduction, so their voices were important. So changing WHO was more kind of technocratic in a sense. It was specialists within WHO. Within the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, who also have responsibilities in this area, it was much slower. And there was tremendous pressure from the US all the time. The US is the biggest donor of UNODC. And there's tremendous pressure for the leadership there to write harm reduction out of all their documents. And I've seen letters from the US State Department threatening, subtly threatening UNODC. I think two things happened. One is UNODC was the chair of UNAIDS at some stage, so they had to kind of modify. And the other was, I suppose it's more a human rights angle, and I was involved in that because we collected evidence that many UNODC programs were breaching human rights and causing harms, health harms and physical harms to drug users. And we presented the head of UNODC with a dossier showing that some of the outcomes of their policing support programs led to executions. And on the back of that, we put in a whole load, they panicked because it's a UN agency. So there were lots of NGO pressures from outside. I think it was also easier than now because there was always a place for NGO engagement in WHO and in UNODC. But with the Framework Convention and the meeting in 2 weeks' time, NGOs with alternative views are excluded. They don't get, it's the most closed off biennial UN meeting ever. Most UN meetings, climate change, whatever, NGOs are all there making a noise, trying to influence what's going on. This is really closed off. So there are parallels, but I'm not quite sure what the learnings are. If I knew the answer, I would be there.
I really enjoy your talk. Maybe to your eyes, I make a very naive comment. Do you see a change of paradigm when the scientific research will produce evidence for no harm? Then the harm reduction paradigms will be completely diluted because nothing needs to be reduced. You know what I mean? Would you like to comment on it?
I think the evidence is important, but thinking back to AIDS and HIV prevention, we didn't have the evidence that this would work. We took a big gamble with needles and syringes. There was some evidence for methadone, and I was involved with the first evaluation of needle exchange throughout the UK. So we didn't really know, but there was a plausible assumption that it would. There's already a plausible assumption about these products, and from the testing. If you're using snus, you're not inhaling, so there's no lung problems. We know that the components of e-cigarettes are minimal, and of tobacco smoke, lots of contaminants, and there's lots of good science which now measures what's in the nicotine fluids, what's in the vapor, and there are people in the audience who know more about that than me. There's also a lot of bad science, and we'll hear about that here today, and it's a lot of the bad science is not picked up by peer review, and then it gets into the media through some media release from the university or the journal. And again, you have these small single studies, 8 cell cultures exposed to vapor, and from that we can deduce that this is going to lead to major morbidity in people who vape. So leaping from the small, often badly designed studies, which in the report might have words like may or could or whatever, to extrapolating to populations is always the problem. But we have that in cancer as well, because we have the International Agency on Research on Cancer, which is also looking at cancer hazards. And of course, there are cancer hazards all around us here. And when we see IARC says the formaldehyde in this carpet is a cancer hazard, well, yes, but it's not really a risk and it's not going to harm us. So there's often, people, they're scary, so it is partly the science, but what we need more of is two things. Well, what we need more of is the better peer review, better science, but also better reviews, systematic reviews, weight of evidence reviews, not taking the single study. The single study will be reported in the UK Daily Mail or in, I don't know, L'Avanguardia or whatever, I know what would be here. but it's the weight of evidence approach which is important, looking at it systematically. And that, I think, is why the Public Health England reports are important, because they look at all the evidence. You can always throw out a study that shows, children dying from e-cigarettes. I'm sorry, I'm being rather flippant. You can always find the single study, but it's the weight of evidence. That's how we need to go forward.
Thank you.
Hi, Gerry. Very nice
Rick,
talk.
thank you.
I think among your case studies, Iceland is the one that really enthusiasms me more. And I was wondering, I have two questions for you. What are the big drivers in the improvement in public health in that island? And second question is, how much of the Icelandic experience can be injected or pollinated in Spain?
Well, they could all come here on holiday, especially in the winter. First point, we need more single country case studies. We've only just started to scratch the surface. And that mentality is not really there in tobacco and smoking researchers, taking a whole country. Okay, it's a different version of the weight of evidence, but taking all that we know about the epidemiology, the historical development of smoking and the adoption of products, the social networks, the cultural fit of different products, modeling, really, it hasn't been told properly for Sweden or for Norway or for Japan. A lot is going on that we don't understand, except, we can see from a distance the statistics look good. So I would encourage donors and funders to fund very intensive single case, single country studies. In Iceland, we should, because everybody in Iceland is on the register. So we could actually look at the changes in smoking, the uptake of snus, and we should be able to quickly be able to monitor changes in health outcomes, which we haven't really been able to do except for, you've done short-term health outcomes, but long-term health outcomes, we've only really got it for Sweden. So that's the potential for Iceland, because everybody is known and everybody's on the database. So really great study could be done there to see whether we're going to pick up early indications of health change. But sadly, I can't really answer your question about how Iceland could change Spain. Or you could send all the Spanish to Iceland. Sorry. Sorry, yes. Oh, you're from Iceland? Yes. Okay, you can answer. Okay. You could do the study.
No.
Right.
I can go.
You can go. You can go. Okay, yes. It's okay? Yeah. Good.